Hello tanks and tankettes, and welcome to a viewer replay. This time it's the T-10 on the Paris map with Cyclone Gaming 123 here at the wheel. Or, well, it's a tank, so levers probably? Not that many tanks actually had steering wheels. So he's in a fairly good position, matchmaking wise. It's a 3-5-7 game, so there are a couple of tier 10s. But there are also quite a lot of tier 8s to shoot at, which is quite nice for this tank. And that means his armour might be somewhat effective as well, because armour-wise this isn't a particularly big upgrade from the IS-3. I think your frontal armour gets a bit better. Your turret is, I think, arguably a little bit weaker than the IS-3's. I can't remember the profile exactly, but I seem to remember the turret actually being a bit squashier than the IS-3's. But it does have very good mobility, and it does have a very good gun. So it basically is a complete contrast to the ST-1, which has the exact same firepower, the exact same gun anyway. Whereas that has got all of the armour, including a monster turret, and it's, you know, fairly slow as a result. This thing is much more about the mobility. It's a very good tank for following in behind medium tanks and you know, carrying a lot bigger of a gun than they have available. But it also means you can do things like this. He spotted this opportunity to flank this small group of enemy tanks that came to the northern choke point here. And he's already been able to lay some serious hurt into this M103. Now this is a good thing, because it means they can potentially win this fight much quicker than they would be able to otherwise, because the enemy team's moisture is here, and that thing is particularly effective at, you know, holding choke points, especially when it's in a position where it's difficult to just rush it. You know, his teammates here could just rush those two tanks, especially as he is now about to kill the M103. In fact, more so given that he's now distracted the Patriot as well, because that is definitely the Patriot version. But they're still taking an awfully long time to kill this moisture, despite the advantage in numbers that they have here. Now, the fact that they have this advantage in numbers here means that the rest of the team's not doing so well in the northern half of the map, so they're now going to have to basically, once they've dealt with the moisture, and we'll see if he gets the kill shot here, which he might do, because they still haven't managed to finish it off. There we go. They're going to have to go back and defend, because otherwise they might be in serious trouble. So he had one shot of heat from the M103, but it really wasn't necessary with the M103's gun. The Patriot, by contrast, didn't even bother with the premium and still punched through his frontal armour with ease. So, yeah, the armour on this, you know, you don't want to rely on it, basically. It's armour that will give you occasional troll bounces, but for the most part, you don't want to just sit out in the open and take it. It's not a tank that you can reliably angle like the Moisture, say, or the ST-1. Especially because it's got that pike nose. You know, you can't even really side scrape safely with it. The positions where you can do that are quite difficult. It works a bit better when you can go hull down, but then it's Russian heavy, so you don't really have particularly good gun depression either. It's definitely a much bigger jump in armor protection going from this to the IS-7 than it is from the IS-3 to this. So they are down on tanks at the moment, but not catastrophically so. We've got a TVP, the T-100LT and the Foch all trying to hold the base, although we've just lost the T-100LT. They're now making their way back, but Cyclone has lost a fairly big chunk of health, and he already made a, you know, he took maybe an extra hit that he didn't have to earlier by just just overexposing himself, pulling out a bit too far. And here again, he stopped to make a shot at a tank that was honestly kind of a low value target. That was a tier 8 medium tank that was a one shot. They could probably have safely left that alone. He got lucky there, in fact. He bounced one of the STRV shots, but didn't bounce the second one. So he's now down to a one shot for a fair few of the things that are left on the enemy team. The Scorpion G, the IS-3, the Ag Tiger, the T-10, and the enemy, the Stridswagen. So his incaution has not really paid off. He exposed himself for a little bit too long there in terms of sitting in front of tanks where he knew there were guns pointed his way. So yeah, that shot the Pershing especially, I think that was just getting a bit greedy, wanting that kill. So they've arrived back at the cap. He's now going to have to much more rely on his teammates, especially this E-75, who is still relatively healthy. But I think both teams are now in a position where there are a couple of tanks, at least on each side, where they don't have a lot of hit points, where they are basically one-shots. So it could snowball quite quickly either way. It just depends, you know, who blinks first and who makes more mistakes. So this time he's being a little bit more cautious because he has to at this point, and he's able to use this mobility to get forward, and if he can kill the low health 59 Patton, that's really good. The Scorpion G has also died to the E-75, but they're about to lose their own T-54, who for some reason went all the way round to just below the enemy cap circle alone, and is now getting rushed by the enemy T-10 and their 103B. So having lost that is not good. Their M46 Patton is also completely isolated from the rest of the team, but the rest of them are at least more working together at this point, and they've got this now isolated IS-3 in the middle to pick on, but that does then put them in the path of fire of the Jagdtiger and potentially the 103, and now know where the enemy T-10 is as well. So being very careful not to shoot the TVP there, that would be a bit bad at this stage of things. Decides to push on the IS-3 and actually gets a bounce, I think, on the outside of the pike. So, like, in positions like this where you're aggressively pushing on an enemy tank, I think that's where the armor works best, because if you get somebody to make a panicked shot at you and they don't have some kind of monster penetration gun, you've got a fairly good chance of things actually bouncing. However, well, his luck kind of slightly didn't hold there. He did bounce another shell from the T-10, but he also got penned once again by the Stridsvagn, who had a just very slightly higher than average roll, and the 103 was also able to kill that low health TVP. So they are running out of tanks, but so is the enemy team, and it's now just 3 versus 3. So he goes hunting for artillery, who just revealed himself by firing and killing the Patton. If he gets at least just about an average roll, he can kill this FE in one shot and manages it. So that's useful. He's not going to have to go and hunt the guy down and kill him with a second shot, because, you know, RNG sometimes rolls that way. You might get lucky, you might not get lucky. He himself has been the recipient of lucky RNG. The Stridsvagn shot that penned him could have killed him if it had rolled a little bit higher. It was already a just above average hit, but if it had been 7 hit points more than that, or 7 damage more than that, well, he'd be dead right now. So 2 versus 2. The E-75 has kept a bunch of hit points, but I mean, he's now realizing the danger of them splitting up, so he is he's probably more likely to be able to safely get back to the E-75, and he's probably also aware that if he's been last spotted here and he's the much lower health target, which they will know at this point, they might try and rush him, and there's not going to be a lot he can do about it. But as it is, it looks like they're going for the E-75 instead, or at least the T-10 is, but he has to be a little bit careful because we still don't know where that Stridsvagn is. So a slightly odd little quirk of the replay there. Yeah, you would think after like this many years the replays would still work, you know, or the replays would be fairly well refined, and they for the most part are fairly well refined, but every so often some little quirk or oddity gets introduced. So he's cautioning the E-75 not to press forwards. I'm not quite sure what his thinking was with that position there, but I mean, he's now decided to come and flank through the middle, and as he was doing this, that's when the Stridsvagn got spotted here as well. And I think the T-10 must have just been waiting for the Stridsvagn to show up, because now he's trying to rush the E-75, and the E-75 is just going to have to rely on his armor for a little bit before Cyclone can turn up to help. So the immediate threat is the T-10. He's able to get the hit in, and that's fine. The E-75 whacks him just after, so it's now 2 versus 1. They have a numbers advantage, but they are themselves both now quite low health. And so Cyclone is being very, very cautious, but they do have the natural advantage of the fact that they are facing a turretless machine. And he can only point his gun in so many directions. He's got to maneuver his entire tank. And the fact that it's a Swedish TD, although, you know, properly it is actually an MBT, but in game terms, you know, it's a tank destroyer. Means that, you know, they can either be in their deployed mode, at which point, you know, the aiming time and everything and the reload, it's very, very nasty. They can't mess around with this machine at all. But if it has to redeploy at all, this machine suddenly becomes very, very vulnerable, which of course doesn't really apply to regular tank destroyers. So unfortunately he is able to put that wicked gun to work, kills the E-75, and well, whoa, I think the 103 fired there. I mean, he's trying to use this wreck to give himself cover, and this is where being a low-profile heavy tank comes in useful. And he also very carefully placed that shot, because the first one he was able to go through the side armor, because the side armor on the Swedish tank destroyers is not good, especially those high-tier ones. Most of them don't have good armor particularly, but once you get to the high tier ones and they get enough armor that the auto bounce factor starts coming into play. So they've left each other on a one shot essentially, but I mean, what he's doing here, you know, this is where it becomes mind game. So he's pulled back, he's made as if to go in one direction, and he's hoping that this Swedish tank destroyer will switch to travel mode. So oh, a bit of packet loss, that's a really bad time, but he's going to have to aim carefully. He's going to have to aim, whoa, there we go, for I think it's like the vision ports. There's like a flattish bit of armor, so just hitting anywhere other than that frontally with this gun would have produced a bounce, I think, but as it was, he got lucky. That wasn't even fully aimed, and a little bit longer, the guy would have been able to switch to his deployed mode and almost certainly would have killed Cyclone. But just that little bit of trickery at the end there gave him that bit of time he needed, and that was it. That was a very creditable win with only 7 hit points remaining. So that was an ace tanker. He had a Spartan, a high caliber, Top Gun, and a steel wall, but really he couldn't have done it without the assistance of some of his allies. He had over 5,000 damage done. The E-75 had nearly 4,500 damage. The TVP had just over 4,500 damage. After that, there is a considerable drop off in the amount of damage done. So, you know, it's not uncommon to see this. You get the top part of a team, especially in a close game like this, being quite disproportionate to the bottom part of the team. And the same kind of goes for the enemy team as well. It was the Stridsvagen with 3,500. Well, in second place in terms of the score, but first place in terms of the damage. It was actually the T-26E5 that they killed early on that was topping the scoreboard on that one somehow. So yeah, that was quite a gripping game towards the end there, and the mobility really did come in useful. He did get, you know, somewhat lucky in some parts, but you know, if he'd had to go and take a second shot at artillery, for example, that would have pulled him away from the E-75 for maybe a bit longer, maybe. But I mean, there was that kind of gap where the teams weren't, you know, actively engaging anyway, where they were kind of probing around when it was just the 2 versus 2 situation left. So maybe that wouldn't have made a difference, but maybe it would have. But certainly, you know, the one bit of RNG that really did, you know, make the difference in this game was him being left on 7 hit points instead of just being killed outright with the Stridsvagen as he passed across the middle. And, you know, getting a bounce from the T-10 at the same time on his side armor. If that hit and penned him, he'd be dead, and this would have been a win for the enemy team. So, you know, RNG absolutely plays a factor, and sometimes it works for you as much as it works against you, and in this case, it did work for Cyclone Gaming. But you always, as a player, have to then take advantage of the situation that RNG has handed you. And sometimes RNG just completely balks you, but very rarely are these kind of situations decided by pure RNG alone, that the player's actions also massively matter. And in this case, Cyclone Gaming was able to keep his cool, and he knew the weak spots that he had to aim for, and that was the critical factor at the end there. He was able to kill that Stridsvagen and wasn't just fruitlessly pinging off shells from the auto bounce angles that the rest of the frontal armor would have presented to him. So yeah, that was quite a gripping game in the end, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did, because yeah, that was quite a good one, I thought. So if you did, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.